very young, 18 years old, standing on a rotating wooden platform while Roman men inspected her teeth and examined her like livestock at a market.
A chalk sign hung around her neck. It listed her qualities, her age, her origin, whether she could cook, whether she was still untouched. By sunset, she would belong to a stranger who could do anything he wanted to her, and Roman law would protect him, not her. This was the Roman slave market, and for millions of women across the ancient world, this was where their nightmare began. How did women end up on that platform? The answer is almost any way you can imagine. War was the biggest source. When Roman armies conquered new territories, they didn't just take land, they took people. Women and girls captured from defeated nations were marched in chains back to Rome, sometimes walking for months across brutal terrain. According to historical records, after major military victories, tens of thousands of captives would flood into Roman slave markets at once. Prices would drop because supply was so high. Human beings sold for less than farm animals. But war wasn't the only path to the auction block. Pirates kidnapped women from coastal villages throughout the Mediterranean. Bandits snatched travelers from roads. Desperate families sold daughters they couldn't afford to feed. And perhaps most disturbing, abandoned babies. Romans legally practiced exposure, leaving unwanted newborns outside to die. But many of these babies didn't die. Slave traders collected them, raised them, and sold them when they were old enough to work. A girl could become a slave simply because her parents didn't want her. The journey to the slave market was itself a horror. Captured women were chained together in long lines called coffles. They walked for weeks, sometimes months. Those who couldn't keep up were beaten. Those who collapsed were left to die. According to ancient sources, the death rate during these forced marches was staggering. For every slave who reached the market, others perished along the way. Those transported by ship faced different terrors. Packed into cargo holds with minimal food and water. Disease spreading rapidly in the cramped, filthy conditions. Women assaulted by sailors during the voyage. By the time survivors reached Rome, they were already broken. But the market itself delivered a new kind of humiliation. The Roman slave markets operated openly in the heart of the city. The largest was near the Temple of Castor in the Forum. Wealthy Romans browsed for household servants the same way they might shop for furniture. Female slaves were displayed on rotating platforms so buyers could view them from all angles. Most were stripped completely naked. Some dealers oiled their skin to make them appear healthier than they actually were. Buyers conducted physical inspections that would horrify us today. They checked teeth to estimate age and health. They examined bodies for scars, brands, or signs of disease. They groped and prodded to assess physical qualities. For virgins they were advertised as virgins, the inspections went further. Buyers paid premium prices for untouched girls, so they demanded verification. Imagine being a 14-year-old girl from a conquered village. 3 months ago, you had a family, a home, a future. Now you're standing naked in a foreign city while strange men examine your body and discuss your price. Prices varied wildly depending on what the buyer wanted. Young, attractive women sold for the highest amounts, especially those destined to become household servants or personal attendants to rich Romans. According to historical records, a skilled female slave could cost anywhere from 2,000 to 6,000 denarii. For comparison, a Roman soldier earned about 900 denarii per year. But beauty and youth drove prices highest. Girls purchased for their appearance often faced the darkest fates, forced into their masters' beds or sold to establishments that exploited them. Older women, those considered less attractive or those with visible defects, sold for far less. They typically became field workers, cleaners, or kitchen slaves. The chalk signs around their necks told buyers everything: age, origin, skills, temperament, and any defects. Some signs included warnings that the slave had attempted escape before, which lowered the price, but guaranteed harsher treatment from the new owner. Once purchased, a female slave was branded or collared to mark ownership. Some masters used hot irons to burn their initials into their slave's skin. Others preferred metal collars inscribed with the owner's name and address, plus instructions for anyone who found her if she ran away. She was property now, legally, socially, completely. She had no name except what her master gave her, no past that mattered, no future she controlled. And as she was led away from the auction block toward her new owner's home, she had no idea what awaited her there. But being sold was just the beginning. What happened inside Roman households, behind closed doors where masters held absolute power, would make the auction block seem almost merciful by comparison. Because under Roman law, a female slave wasn't a person. She was a thing.
Chapter 2. Property without rights. The legal reality. Under Roman law, a female slave wasn't a person. She was a res, a thing, the same legal category as a chair, a cow, or a cooking pot. Her master didn't just own her labor, he owned her body, her future, her children, everything. And what he chose to do with his property was entirely his business. Let me be clear about what this meant in practice. A Roman master could beat his female slave until she couldn't walk. Legal. He could starve her as punishment. Legal. He could force himself upon her whenever he wanted. Completely legal. He could kill her if she displeased him. For most of Roman history, absolutely legal. There was no court she could appeal to, no authority that would listen to her, no crime her master could commit against her, because legally you cannot commit a crime against property. She was not a victim, she was an object. The Roman legal system spelled this out explicitly. According to ancient legal texts, slaves were classified as res mancipi, the same category that included land, livestock, and beasts of burden. When disputes arose about slaves, Roman courts treated them exactly like property disputes. If your neighbor's slave damaged your property, you sued the neighbor, not the slave. The slave couldn't be sued because the slave wasn't a legal person. This wasn't an oversight or a loophole. This was deliberate, systematic dehumanization written into the foundation of Roman civilization. And for female slaves, this legal non-existence had devastating consequences. A master's access to his female slaves' bodies was considered a basic property right. Ancient sources discuss this openly. Roman men wrote casually about using their slave women. Philosophers debated whether it was wise to become too attached to a particular slave. Poets joked about sneaking into the slave quarters at night. None of them questioned whether the women wanted this. The concept didn't exist. There was no word in Latin for what we would call consent in this context. A slave's wishes were legally meaningless. Her body belonged to her master the same way her hands belonged to him for labor. If she resisted, she could be punished. If she complained, she could be sold. If she fought back, she could be killed. Most learned quickly that survival meant submission. But it wasn't just the master she had to worry about. Many Roman masters allowed their sons to use female household slaves as practice before marriage. This was considered normal, even educational. Guests in the household sometimes expected access to attractive slaves as part of Roman hospitality. Refusing could insult the guest and anger the master. Other male slaves in the household might assault female slaves. Sometimes masters encouraged this to produce new slaves. Children born to enslaved mothers automatically became the master's property, regardless of who the father was. The child was property from birth. Masters often sold these children away from their mothers. Sometimes they kept them to increase their slave holdings. Sometimes they exposed them, leaving them outside to die or be collected by slave traders. A female slave had no legal right to keep her own children, no right to protect them, no right to even hold them if her master decided otherwise. Imagine carrying a child for 9 months, giving birth in pain, nursing that baby, and then watching as your master sells your child to a stranger. This happened constantly, for centuries. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Roman slave law was how testimony worked in court. If a slave needed to provide testimony in a legal case, that testimony was only considered valid if obtained through torture. The Romans believed slaves would naturally lie to protect themselves or their masters. Only physical pain, they reasoned, would compel truth. So female slaves called as witnesses were routinely tortured, stretched on racks, burned with hot irons, whipped, simply to make their words admissible in court. They weren't being punished for wrongdoing. They were being tortured as standard legal procedure. Because their words, like their bodies, had no inherent value. This was the psychological destruction that Roman slavery inflicted. Not just the physical suffering, not just the labor, not just the violations. It was the complete erasure of personhood. Every day, in every interaction, a female slave was reminded that she was nothing, that her pain didn't matter, that her wishes were irrelevant, that her very existence depended entirely on someone else's whim. Some women broke under this pressure. Some retreated into themselves, becoming the empty objects Roman law claimed they were. But the daily reality of living this legal nightmare, the actual hours and days and years of suffering, was even worse than the laws that enabled it. Because what happened inside Roman households, behind closed doors, would haunt these women until their final breath.
Chapter 3. Daily Horrors. What she endured. She woke before dawn. She worked until her master slept. And between those hours she faced suffering that would break most people within days. Yet Roman female slaves endured this for years, decades, entire lifetimes. This was the daily reality that no legal document could capture. The type of work a female slave performed depended on her master's needs and her appearance. Some became domestic servants, cooking, cleaning, washing clothes by hand until their knuckles bled, carrying water, emptying chamber pots, scrubbing floors on hands and knees from sunrise to sunset. Others worked in the fields alongside male slaves, harvesting grain under brutal sun, crushing grapes with bare feet for hours, hauling loads that left permanent damage to their spines and joints. Some were forced to work in fulleries, the Roman equivalent of laundromats, standing in vats of urine used to clean wool, the ammonia burning their skin and lungs.
but the women considered attractive often faced the darkest assignments. Many female slaves were purchased specifically for their bodies. Wealthy Roman men kept female slaves as personal attendants who were expected to provide more than household service. These women lived in a nightmare of constant availability, summoned to the master's chambers whenever he desired, regardless of the hour, regardless of her exhaustion, regardless of anything. Some masters kept multiple women this way, rotating through them based on mood. The women had no choice. Resistance meant punishment. Refusal was impossible. They learned to disconnect their minds from their bodies just to survive. And survival meant enduring violations that happened not once, not occasionally, but routinely, nightly, for years. Being favored by the master brought its own special torture. If a master showed particular interest in one slave, she became a target for everyone else's cruelty. The master's wife often viewed these women as threats. Roman matrons couldn't legally stop their husbands from using slaves, but they could make those slaves' lives unbearable. Historical records describe Roman wives who had a female slave's face branded with hot irons, not for any offense, but because her husband looked at the girl too often. Caught between the master's demands and the mistress's rage, these women had no safe ground to stand on. Punishment was constant and creative. Minor offenses, a broken dish, a late meal, a perceived look of disrespect could result in beatings with rods, whips, or bare fists. More serious infractions brought worse consequences. Hot irons pressed against skin, hair torn out at the roots, teeth knocked out, fingers broken. Some masters used starvation as punishment. Others preferred public humiliation, forcing slaves to work naked or making them wear signs describing their offenses. And for slaves who truly angered their masters, there was the ergastulum. The ergastulum was an underground prison found on many Roman estates. Slaves who attempted escape, who fought back, or who simply displeased their masters enough could be sentenced to the ergastulum. These were underground chambers, dark, cramped, often flooded with water or sewage. Slaves in the ergastulum were typically chained to the walls or floor. They worked during the day in heavy shackles, then returned to darkness each night. Some spent months in these conditions, others spent years. Many never emerged. Female slaves in the ergastulum faced additional horrors. Chained and helpless in the darkness, they were vulnerable to guards, to other prisoners, to anyone with access. The ergastulum wasn't just punishment, it was a threat that hung over every slave's head, ensuring compliance through terror. Work hours were endless. A female domestic slave might work 16 to 18 hours daily. She woke before the family to prepare the household. She served throughout the day. She cleaned after the family retired. She slept a few hours on a thin mat on a stone floor. There were no days off, no holidays, no rest. Illness provided no relief. Sick slaves were often punished for laziness or simply left to recover on their own while still expected to work. Pregnancy brought no accommodation. Female slaves worked until labor began, gave birth with minimal assistance, and returned to duties within days. And then came the cruelest part. Children born to slaves belonged to the master. A woman could carry a child for 9 months, endure the agony of birth, nurse that baby, love that baby, and then watch helplessly as her master decided the child's fate. Some children were kept and raised as slaves in the household. Some were sold immediately after birth. Some were simply disposed of, exposed outside to die. A mother's grief meant nothing. Her tears meant nothing. Her bond with her child meant nothing, because she was property, and property doesn't have feelings that matter. Some women couldn't endure this existence. They sought ways to escape, either by running or by ending their own suffering permanently. But the Romans had perfected methods to prevent both, and what they did to women who tried to break free would make everything we've discussed so far seem almost gentle.
Chapter 4. Punishment and Control. Breaking the Spirit. A female slave who displeased her master faced punishments designed not just to hurt her body, but to destroy her will to resist. And if she tried to escape, the Romans had perfected methods that would make death seem like mercy. This was how Rome maintained control over millions of human beings for centuries. Through systematic, calculated terror. Routine punishment was part of daily life. A meal served cold, a floor not scrubbed properly, a look that seemed disrespectful. Any of these could trigger immediate violence. The most common punishment was beating. Masters kept rods, whips, and leather straps specifically for disciplining slaves. Some households had designated punishment rooms where the sounds of suffering wouldn't disturb the family's meals. According to ancient sources, beatings were so routine that Roman writers discussed the proper technique. How many strokes for which offense, which instruments left marks, and which didn't. How to beat a slave without permanently damaging valuable property. Female slaves learned to accept these beatings silently. Crying out often extended the punishment. Begging made it worse. They learned to endure. But minor beatings were just the beginning. For more serious offenses, masters turned to creative cruelty. Hot irons pressed against skin, sometimes to brand ownership, sometimes purely as punishment. The scars served as permanent reminders of disobedience. Hair torn out by the roots. Roman texts mention masters who ripped out clumps of their female slaves' hair during fits of rage. Food deprivation lasting days or weeks. A starving slave still had to work, growing weaker while watching others eat. Isolation in tiny, dark spaces. Some masters locked disobedient slaves in closets or underground chambers for extended periods. Public humiliation, forcing slaves to wear naked or making them wear signs describing their crimes for all to mock. And for the most serious offenses, mutilation, cutting off ears, slicing noses, gouging out eyes. These punishments marked slaves as troublemakers for life and made them nearly impossible to sell. The furca was a particularly cruel Roman punishment device. It was a heavy wooden yoke shaped like the letter Y that was locked around a slave's neck and wrists. The slave was forced to wear it while continuing to work, unable to feed herself, unable to rest her arms, unable to escape the constant weight and pain. Some slaves wore the furca for days, others for weeks. The device didn't just cause physical suffering, it marked the wearer as a troublemaker for everyone to see. Other slaves avoided her, fearing association with someone being punished. The furca isolated its victims while torturing them slowly. But nothing struck more terror into slaves' hearts than the punishment for running away. Escape attempts were treated as the ultimate betrayal, and the Romans responded with maximum brutality. Captured runaways were typically beaten nearly to death, then branded on the forehead with the letters FUG for fugitivus, runaway. This facial brand ensured everyone would know forever that this slave had tried to escape. Some masters had special metal collars made for recaptured runaways. These collars were inscribed with the owner's name and address, plus instructions, "I have run away. Return me to my master." The collars couldn't be removed without tools. They marked the wearer as a flight risk, reducing her value and ensuring harsher treatment from any future owner. For slaves who repeatedly tried to escape or who committed violence against their masters, the punishment was crucifixion. Yes, the same execution method later used for criminals and religious dissidents.
Slaves were crucified along Roman roads as warnings to others. They hung for days, dying slowly from exhaustion, exposure, and suffocation. After the Spartacus slave rebellion in 73 BC, the Romans crucified 6,000 captured slaves along the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome. 6,000 crosses, 6,000 bodies stretching for over 100 miles. The message was clear. This is what happens when slaves resist. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating form of control was the destruction of family bonds. Masters deliberately separated families as both punishment and prevention. A slave who caused trouble might watch her children sold to different owners, scattered across the empire, never to be seen again. The threat alone kept many women compliant. Romantic relationships between slaves were forbidden or tightly controlled. Masters didn't want slaves forming bonds that might inspire resistance or escape attempts. Some masters forced particular slaves to produce children together, breeding humans like livestock, then separated mothers from babies shortly after birth. The complete control over reproduction, family, and love was designed to break something deeper than bones. These punishments weren't random cruelty. They were calculated systems of control. Every beating taught a lesson. Every branding sent a message. Every crucifixion along the roadside reminded millions of slaves what awaited them if they stepped out of line. The Romans understood that controlling bodies wasn't enough. They needed to control minds, break spirits, destroy hope itself. And for most slaves, it worked. Most never tried to escape. Most never resisted. Most simply endured, day after day, year after year, until death finally released them. But some refused to be broken. Some women found ways to survive, and a rare few actually found paths to freedom. Though even freedom came with chains of its own.
Chapter 5: Survival, Freedom, and Legacy. Freedom existed for some Roman female slaves, but it came with a price. And even free women carried invisible chains that never fully released them. Still, after everything we've discussed, the auctions, the violations, the punishments, the broken families, some women survived. Some even escaped the system entirely. Their stories deserve to be told. How did a female slave gain freedom? The most common path was manumission, being formally released by her master. But this wasn't charity. Masters freed slaves for specific reasons. Some freed slaves in their wills after a lifetime of service. A woman might serve faithfully for 40 years and finally become free when her master died, if he remembered her in his final wishes. Some freed slaves who had earned money through side work, tips, small trades, selling handmade goods. A slave could sometimes save enough over many years to purchase her own freedom, but the price was set by the master, who could demand far more than she was worth. And some masters freed slaves who had borne them children. A woman forced into her master's bed might gain freedom as a twisted reward for producing heirs he acknowledged. And some women gained freedom through manipulation, convincing masters they were more valuable as freed clients than as slaves. But freedom wasn't truly free. A freed slave, called a libertina, still owed obligations to her former master, now called her patron. She was legally required to show respect, provide services, and sometimes continue working for him. She couldn't testify against him in court. She couldn't refuse reasonable requests. If she failed these obligations, she could be re-enslaved. The patron also had first claim on her inheritance. If she died without children,
Everything she'd earned went back to the man who once owned her. And society never forgot what she had been. Freed women couldn't hold public office. Their children faced social stigma. Wealthy Romans refused to marry them. The mark of slavery followed them and their descendants for generations. Freedom meant escaping the worst horrors. It didn't mean equality. Despite everything, some freed women built remarkable lives. Archaeological evidence reveals tombstones commissioned by freed women who became successful business owners. Some ran shops, others managed taverns. A few accumulated real wealth. One famous inscription tells of a freed woman named Eumachia, who became so wealthy in Pompeii that she funded the construction of a major public building. Her name was carved in stone for all to see, a former slave whose success rivaled free-born citizens. But for every Eumachia, thousands of freed women struggled in poverty. They worked the same jobs they had as slaves, cleaning, cooking, serving, just now for wages that barely sustained them. And millions never gained freedom at all. They lived as slaves. They died as slaves. Their names were never recorded. How large was this system? Historians estimate that 25 to 40% of Rome's population consisted of slaves at the empire's peak. In a city of 1 million people, that means up to 400,000 human beings in bondage. Across the entire empire, the numbers reach into the tens of millions. And roughly half were women and girls. For 4 centuries, this system operated at massive scale, generation after generation born into chains, entire populations existing only to serve. How did it end? Slowly, painfully, and incompletely. Christianity's spread introduced new ideas about human dignity, though early Christians didn't immediately abolish slavery. The church sometimes owned slaves itself. But gradually attitudes shifted. Manumission became more common. Laws slowly improved conditions. Economic changes made slavery less practical in some regions. By the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, slavery was declining, though it never fully disappeared. It transformed into medieval serfdom, then other forms of bondage that persisted for centuries more. The system didn't end because Romans suddenly recognized its evil. It ended because empires fell and economies changed. So what do we do with this history? These women existed. They had names we'll never know. They had dreams that were crushed. They had children who were stolen. They had bodies that weren't their own. For centuries, they were forgotten. History books celebrated Roman engineering, Roman law, Roman philosophy, while barely mentioning the millions of enslaved people who built that civilization with their suffering. They deserve to be remembered. Not as statistics, not as background context, but as human beings who endured unimaginable cruelty, and somehow, some of them survived. And here's the uncomfortable truth we need to face. Rome was considered the height of civilization. Romans saw themselves as enlightened, sophisticated, superior. They created systems we still admire today. And they built it all on systematic human trafficking, exploitation, and suffering. If they could be so blind to the evil in their own society, what are we blind to in ours? What will people 2,000 years from now look back on and wonder how we could have accepted it? Don't forget these women. Share their stories. Remember their suffering. And ask yourself what invisible chains still exist in our world today. Because history isn't just about the past. It's a warning about who we might become if we stop paying attention.